Hello friends and welcome back to Pages and Pens. My name is Julie and today I am here with some high fantasy recommendations. Let's jump right into it. I have been loving fantasy this year. Last year was the year of thriller, horror books. This year I am all in on the fantasy. But what I wanted to do was to recommend some accessible high fantasy books. Books not set in our world. So it's not going to have any of our worldly hints. Things like Strange Grace by Tessa Gratton is set in our world, but in this specific town in our world. Things like the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab, Victoria Schwab, I forget which she publishes under for each series. She's one person. That has Shades of London, so it's a completely different world, but there is that like real world vibe of like an actual place that exists here. Is it still a high fantasy? Maybe technically, but I don't know. I'm going with things that exist outside of our world. An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir, which exists completely in another world. I don't have those books anymore, but I do enjoy that series, and it's a good one to kind of transition into more epic and richer world building. Not that those are not rich world building, but there's some intimidating ones out there. So let me jump in. Let me tell you what I have. Let me show you my recommendations. First up in the YA category is Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. I adore this book. Also, an Enchantment of Ravens I don't think takes place in our world. That might also count as like a high fantasy. Not 100% sure. But this does not take place in our world, and it does have magic, it has demons, it has like sorcerers, and then also humans. It has a queer main love interest. I believe he identifies as bisexual. Bisexual men in fantasy are not that well represented, but I thought this one did it really well. Badass main character who is charged with or lives at these libraries where librarians are charged with keeping books that can turn into beasts at bay. So they are charged with keeping these specific books housed in safe ways so that the demons that the books become don't get loose. And then murders ensue, and our main character is suspected of maybe helping these books escape. So this has some of my favorite characters, some of my favorite themes like books and libraries, and the love interest in this is fantastic. The side character Silas is everything. I loved it. I thought it was a really accessible entrance into high fantasy. Another YA that is a little bit richer and denser in terms of world building and mythology and storyboarding, Furyborn by Claire Legrand. This is the Lightbringer? No, this is the Emporium trilogy. I have the whole thing back here. I've only gotten to book 2. I have not read Lightbringer yet, so I have not finished the series, but I hope to this year. And this is about 2 queens in 2 timelines, and then you figure out how they're linked. One is going to bring ruin, one is going to bring salvation, and we figure out who is who. Each one of them has a distinct set of lovers and love interests that are also very queer, very diverse, and there's a lot of discussion in here about having a period, about birth control. This is just a very feminist, cool take on a modern epic high fantasy, and it is a little bit more in depth than Sorcery of Thorns, but this is also a great bridge into the more traditional, older, white man, like deep fantasy. So this is a great start as well. Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea was also not one of my favorite books, so I have since unhauled it. However, I do think it's an accessible start to fantasy, and it is an epic high fantasy written by a woman, and it was a game changer. So if you're interested, Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin could also be something that you enjoy if you want to go back to that more old school traditional epic high fantasy, but written from a woman. That could be a cool one for you to try out. I'm going to include one that I technically shouldn't, and that's Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. This does take place partially in our world, but the majority of this story, the true crux of this story, takes place in another world, in another realm. It's not a portal fantasy. I guess it is a portal fantasy, but this takes place almost entirely in another world with demons and angels and gods and tooth magic, and it is so complex. It is so beautiful and so richly woven, and I did really, really enjoy this series. So this is one that I think I'm gonna allow because for the most part it doesn't take place in our world. It takes place in another world. So some of it's in Prague, the majority of it is in another world. Is that cheating? I don't know, maybe. But I can also say Strange the Dreamer and Muse of Nightmares. They're up. I don't think you can see them, can you? You can't. But these also absolutely qualify for beautiful high fantasy, epic fantasy. These do not take place in our world. This again follows these gods, a forgotten library, a forgotten city of Weep where nobody can remember what this city used to be called. There's one librarian who can remember this city. Doesn't know why he's the only person that can remember this city, but then he's offered the chance to travel there and to see what exists there still. And then the story continues. This is about Laszlo Strange, and I adore this series. It is a beautiful series. Do I own the US editions? Yes. Do I also own these gorgeous UK editions with the sprayed edges? Yes. Do I also have special edition versions coming from LitJoy? Yes. Will I own 3 of these? I will. Yeah. And I cannot wait to get those and to show you those. Those come this summer. So stay tuned. I think they might still be available for pre-order if you go to LitJoy. I believe I have LitJoy listed down below in my description, so you can check that out. Do think that this has a mythology and a history to it that is very rich, a world that is entirely its own, but it is accessible. I will say, Laini Taylor's writing, especially in this series, is not for everybody, but I adore her prose. I adore her writing style in this book, and I do think that it just weaves a very rich story. Not going to be for everybody, but it absolutely is for me. Like, it works 1000% for me personally. Then I want to throw it out to a series that ebbs and flows for me. This is the Nevernight series by Jay Kristoff. Again, this takes place in a world entirely not our own, with assassins and schools for assassins and political machinations. We do have queer characters. We do have a bisexual main character, and I liked this world, and I liked the ruthlessness of it all. However, I had issues with the series as a whole. I did not enjoy book 2. It fell into that, like, gladiator survival trope that I don't love for high fantasy, which some of Furyborn, Kingsbane fell into as well. I don't love that, like, battle kind of thing where it's like you're set against other people or even yourself sometimes. Don't love that in fantasy. The second book of this does fall into that. And then the third book wraps up with a ship that I don't love. Like, I didn't love some parts of this book, but then there were other parts that I really, really enjoyed. This one toes a line where some people love it, some people hate it. Some people don't like the footnotes that exist in here. I think that for the most part, I skipped them in the first book. And then in later books, I started looking at them a little bit just because they were kind of sassy and snarky. Overall, I enjoyed the ride. Is it a favorite? No, but I enjoyed it overall. I'm going to get into probably my top 2 favorite high fantasy authors / books / series. So let's talk about that. First, I'm going to mention Brandon Sanderson. Warbreaker is a standalone. I think this is a fantastic place to enter Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, which is what he calls the world that he writes a lot of his books in. This one was really cool. It's about gods that live in this city and a girl that's meant to marry one of, like, the ultimate gods in this city, and then she's replaced by her sister. Rescue mission that takes place from there to try to go take this girl back to her home because she was never trained to go and marry this god and isn't ready for all of the political things that happen within this world. It is so twisty and so well written. I loved it. The magic system is really cool. But this is an entire new world and an entire new magic system based on colors and breath and this, like, essence of people. I really loved it. I really, really loved it. This could be a great start into next tier level epic high fantasy. Really, really enjoyed it. Then I have the first of the Mistborn series, which is The Final Empire, also by Brandon Sanderson, also taking place technically in the same universe as Warbreaker. This has a completely different magic system, though. This one is based on metals and ingesting different metals, and those metals allowing you to have heightened hearing, heightened strength, to have different awareness of space and time. This is by far and away one of my favorite fantasy series, if not my favorite fantasy series. The arc in this is phenomenal, and just the story overall through these 3 books ebbs and flows so well. The characters are so beautiful, and I absolutely care for so many of them. And he doesn't really shy away from putting those characters in harm's way, and I do enjoy that. So overall, really, really recommend the Final Empire series by Brandon Sanderson. I am hoping to read a lot more from him this year. I have his other series back here that I will be getting to hopefully soon, because again, fantasy is just my jam lately. And then I don't think any fantasy rec would be complete without The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is The Hobbit, The Fellowship of the Rings, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. I don't love The Hobbit. Maybe that's just me, but I just don't. This is like a little tiny box set. These are like the thinnest little pages, but this is The Fellowship of the Ring, and it is gorgeous. This was gifted to me, and when I tell you tiny little words on thin little pages, thin pages, like we're talking, if Tolkien had a Bible, this would be the Bible. I also have a giant one up there that's the whole series wrapped up into one large book. I used to have the individual movie tie-ins, and I don't know where those went, but yeah, I have multiple copies of that series. It's one of my favorite series, and one of the times that I think the movies are really well done, but I still 1000% prefer the books. There are full storylines in this book that are just ignored in the movies that I loved. By far, still the books for me. Absolutely love them. Are there more high fantasy books that I have not talked about? Absolutely. So let's also discuss that. While I can't include these in a recommendation, as in I give my stamp of approval, these are fantastic books, I absolutely love them, I'm going to mention them, and if these aren't technically high fantasy, I apologize, because again, I have not read them. And I like to kind of go into these books not knowing a ton, just a stack of books that I want to read that are on my shelves that I haven't yet. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, who is a person of color, a woman of color, and this is apparently an amazing high fantasy series. I have not started it yet. I want to. I have not. Samantha Shannon's The Bone Season, which I believe has a sapphic relationship in it, I saw recently. Somebody mentioned, maybe. So there's queer characters in this. I don't know anything about it. It might not be high fantasy, but I believe it is. Oh, it says London on the back. So maybe not. The Black Prism by Brent Weeks, which again is color magic. I don't know anything about this. This could be set in our world. It could not be. But this is another intimidating to me fantasy that I want to get to this year, maybe. I've got The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which I believe, again, is an epic high fantasy. I haven't started it, again, because this series is not finished. And I don't necessarily want to get into something where I have no guarantee the series will ever finish. I have read the entire Game of Thrones series up until what has been published, and I'm not going to continue. At this point, I have no interest in continuing that. But I guess if you really wanted a high fantasy series, that would be a great one for you. But, like, just be prepared. You're probably not going to ever get an ending, and a lot of the books are very unsatisfying and wordy. Do we deserve better than the show? Yeah. Do I want to continue in the books to get that? No. And then last up on my TBR on my shelves that I'm going to talk about is S.A. Chakraborty's City of Brass. I know I need to read this. I know I'm going to love it. This has, like, djinn magic, I believe, in it. And I want to be in it. I want to read it. I just haven't picked it up yet. I don't know what about this is so intimidating to me, but they are. For whatever reason, these have just been really intimidating to me. Do I have more on my shelves than this? Yeah, I do. But these are the ones that I picked out because I think that these are ones that are universally kind of read on BookTube that I still have not gotten to, which is why this shelf behind me is so empty. That's because that's my fantasy TBR shelf, and I had to take all the books off of it. I have the Obsidian Tower that I still want to get to. I believe that's completely high fantasy. Spellslinger by Sebastian de Castell is still back here. I have A Dance of Thieves and A Vow of Thieves, I think, maybe, by Mary E. Pearson that are still back here. That might be a great series for you as well if you're new to fantasy, is her Remnant Chronicles, A Kiss of Deception series. That was very accessible, very readable. I have since unhauled them because I enjoyed the story arc, but oh man, that character arc annoyed me. But in general, very good book. And another woman in fantasy, which I always love supporting. Those are my fantasy recs. Also, The Lies of Locke Remora by an author who I'm forgetting. I have read that, but I listened to the audiobook and I don't own a physical copy. And I haven't continued with the series. But man, what a book that was. That was a ride. Those were my fantasy recs. Were they all high fantasy? Maybe not technically. Honestly, if I counted the Daughter of Smoke and Bone, I should have counted the Darker Shades of Magic series, or the Shades of Magic series. So we'll throw that in there. It's back there. I have it. It's right there. That's gonna be it for this video. If you liked this, give me a big thumbs up, click subscribe, and I will see all of you in my next video. Bye, friends. I'm just breaking my pinky. God dang it.